Part 6. Red Star in the Northwest. 1. The Shanxi Soviets. Beginnings. While the communists in Jiangxi, Fujian and Hunan from 1927 onward gradually built bases for their opposition to Nanjing, Red Armies appeared in other widely scattered parts of China. Of these, the biggest single area was the Henan and Hubei Soviet, which covered a good part of those three rich provinces in the central Yangtze Valley, and embraced a population of more than 2 million people. The Red Army there began under the command of Xu Haidang, and later on to lead it came Xu Xiangqian, a graduate of the first class of Huangpu Academy, a former colonel in the Kuomintang Army, and a veteran of the Guangzhou Commune. Far in the mountains to the northwest of them, another Huangpu cadet, Liu Zhitan, was laying the foundations for the Soviet areas in Shanxi, Gansu, and Ningxia. Liu was a modern Robin Hood, with the mountaineer's hatred of rich men. Among the poor he was becoming a name of promise, and among landlords and moneylenders, the scourge of the gods. This chaotic warrior was born in the hill-cradled town of Bao'an, North Shanxi, the son of a landlord family. He went to high school in Yulin, which stood under the shadow of the Great Wall, and was the seat of Shanxi's prosperous trade with the caravans of Mongolia. Leaving Yulin, Liu Zhitan secured an appointment at the Huangpu Academy in Guangzhou, completed his course there in 1926, and became a communist and a young officer in the Kuomintang. With the nationalist expedition as far as Hankou, he was there when the split occurred in the Kuomintang Communist Alliance. In 1927, following the Nanjing coup d'etat, he fled from the purgation and worked secretly for the Communist Party in Shanghai. Returning to his native province in 1928, he re-established connections with some of his former comrades then in the Kuominjun, the People's Army, of General Feng Yuxiang. Next year he led a peasant uprising in South Shanxi. Although Liu's uprising was sanguinarily suppressed, out of it grew the nucleus of the first guerrilla bands of Shanxi. Liu Zhitan's career from 1929 to 1932 was a kaleidoscope of defeats, failures, discouragements, escapades, adventure, and remarkable escapes from death, interspersed with periods of respectability as a reinstated officer. Several small armies under him were completely destroyed. Once he was made head of the Mintuan at Bao'an, and he used his office to arrest and execute several landlords and moneylenders. Strange behavior for a Mintuan leader. The magistrate of Bao'an was dismissed, and Liu fled, with but 3 followers, to a neighbouring Xian. There one of General Feng Yuxiang's officers invited them to a banquet, in the midst of which Liu and his friends disarmed their hosts, seized 20 guns, and made off to the hills, where they soon collected a following of about 300 men. This little army was surrounded, however, and Liu sued for peace. His offer was accepted, and he became a colonel in the Kuomintang Army, with a garrison post in West Shanxi. Again he began an anti-landlord movement, and again he was outlawed, this time arrested. Owing chiefly to his influence in the Shanxi Gelao Hui, he was pardoned once more, but his troops were reorganized into a transportation brigade, of which he was made commander. And then, for the 3rd time, Liu Zhitan repeated the error of his ways. Some landlords in his district, long accustomed to tax exemption, a more or less hereditary right of landlords in Shanxi, refused to pay taxes. Liu promptly arrested a number of them, with the result that the gentry rose up in arms and demanded that Xi'an remove and punish him. His troops were surrounded and disarmed. Finally he was driven back to Bao'an with a price on his head, but followed by many young communist officers and men from his own brigade. Here at last he set about organizing an independent army under a red flag in 1931, took possession of Bao'an and Zhongyang counties, and rapidly pushed operations in North Shanxi. Government troops sent against him very often turned over to the Reds in battle. Deserters even drifted across the Yellow River from Shanxi to join this outlaw, whose daredevilry, courage, and impetuousness soon won him fame throughout the Northwest, and created the usual legend that he was invulnerable to bullets. Killings of officials, tax collectors, and landlords became widespread. Unleashing long-hushed fury, the armed peasants raided, plundered, carried off captives, who they held for ransom in their fortified areas, and conducted themselves much like ordinary bandits. By 1932, Liu Zhitan's followers had occupied 11 counties in the Low S Hills of northern Shanxi, and the Communist Party had organized a political department at Yulin to direct Liu's troops. Early in 1933, the first Shanxi Soviet and a regular administration were established, and a program was attempted similar to that in Jiangxi. In 1934 and 1935, these Shanxi Reds expanded considerably, improved their armies, and somewhat stabilized conditions in their districts. A Shanxi Provisional Soviet government was set up, a party training school established, and military headquarters were located at Anding. The Soviets opened their own bank and post office and began to issue crude money and stamps. In the completely Sovietized areas, a Soviet economy was begun. Landlord's land was confiscated and redistributed. All surtaxes were abolished, cooperatives were opened, and a call was sent out by the party to enlist members to volunteer as teachers for primary schools. Meanwhile, Liu Zhitan moved well south of the Red Base toward the capital. He occupied Lindeng, just outside Xianfu, and besieged the city for some days, without success. A column of Reds pushed down to southern Shanxi and established Soviets in several counties there. They had some bad defeats and reverses in battles with General Yang Hucheng, later to become the Reds' ally, and they won some victories. As discipline increased in the army and bandit elements were eliminated, support for the Reds deepened among the peasantry. By the middle of 1935, the Soviets controlled 22 counties in Shanxi and Gansu. The 26th and 27th Red Armies, with a total of over 5,000 men, were now under Liu Zhitan's command and could establish contact by radio with the main forces of the Red Army in the south and in the west. As the Southern Reds began to withdraw from their Jiangxi-Fujian base, these hillmen of Shanxi greatly strengthened themselves, until in 1935 Chiang Kai-shek was forced to send his vice commander-in-chief, Marshal Jiang Shuiliang, to lead a big army against them. Late in 1934, the 25th Red Army under Xu Haideng left Henan with some 8,000 men. By October, it had reached South Shanxi and connected with about 1,000 Red partisans in that area who'd been armed by Liu Zhitan. Xu encamped for the winter there, helped the partisans build a regular army, fought several successful battles against General Yang Hucheng's troops, and armed peasants in 5 counties of South Shanxi. A provisional Soviet government was established, with Zheng Weishan, a 23-year-old member of the Central Committee of Shanxi Province, as chairman, and Li Longgui and Cheng Shanrui as commanders of 2 independent Red brigades. Leaving them to defend this area, Xu Haideng then moved into Gansu with his 25th Army and fought his way into the Soviet districts through thousands of government troops, capturing 5 county seats en route and disarming 2 regiments of Mohammedan troops under General Ma Hengbing. On July 25th of 1935, the 25th, 26th, and 27th Armies united near Yongchang, North Shanxi. Their troops were reorganized into the 15th Red Army Corps, with Xu Haideng as commander and Liu Zhitan as vice commander and chairman of the Shanxi Gansu Shanxi Revolutionary Military Committee. In August 1935, this army corps met and defeated 2 divisions of Dongbei or Manchurian troops under General Wang Yizhe. New recruits were added, as well as much-needed guns and ammunition. And now a curious thing occurred. In August there came to North Shanxi a delegate of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, a stout young gentleman named Zhang Jingfu, Zhang Mudao perhaps, according to my informant, who was then a staff officer under Liu Zhitan. This Mr. Zhang, nicknamed Zhang the Corpulent, was empowered to reorganize the party and the army. He was a kind of super-inspector. Zhang the Corpulent proceeded to collect evidence to prove that Liu Zhitan had not followed the party line. He tried Liu and demanded his resignation from all posts. Liu Zhitan did not put Mr. Zhang against the wall as an interloper for presuming to criticize him, but retired from all active command and went Achilles-like to sulk in his cave in Bao'an. Mr. Zhang also ordered the arrest and imprisonment of more than 100 other reactionaries in the party and the army, and quietly sat back, well satisfied with himself. It was into this queer scene that the vanguard of the Southern Reds, the 1st Army Corps, headed by Lin Biao, Zhou Enlai, Peng Dehuai, and Mao Zedong, entered in October 1935. According to my local informants in Bao'an, Mao and his Politburo called for a re-examination of evidence, found most of it baseless, discovered that Zhang Jingfu had exceeded his orders and been misled by reactionaries himself. They reinstated Liu and all his confederates. Zhang the Corpulent was himself arrested, tried, imprisoned for a longer term, and given menial tasks to perform. Thus it happened that when, early in 1936, the combined Red Armies attempted their famous anti-Japanese expedition, crossed the river and invaded neighboring Shanxi, Liu Zhitan was again in command. He distinguished himself in that remarkable campaign, during which the Reds occupied over 18 counties of the so-called Model Province in 2 months. He was fatally wounded in March 1936 when he led a raiding party against an enemy fortification, the capture of which enabled the Red Army to cross the Yellow River. Liu Zhitan was carried back to Shanxi and died gazing upon the hills he had roamed and loved as a boy. and among the mountain people he had led along the road he believed in, the road of revolutionary struggle. He was buried at Waiyabao, and the Soviets renamed a county of their Red China after him, Zhitanxian. In Bao'an I met his widow and his child, a beautiful little girl of 6. The Reds had tailored her a special uniform. She wore an officer's belt and a red star on her cap. She was the idol of everybody there. Young Liu carried herself like a field marshal, and she was mightily proud of her bandit father. But although Liu Jitan was the personality around which the Soviets of the Northwest grew up, it was not Liu, but the conditions of life itself which produced this convulsive movement of his people. And to understand whatever success they had, it was necessary not so much just now to look at what these men fought for, as to examine what they fought against. 2. Death and taxes. During the Great Northwest Famine, which lasted roughly for 3 years and affected 4 huge provinces, I visited some of the drought-stricken areas of Suiyuan on the edge of Mongolia in June 1929. How many people starved to death in those years I do not accurately know, and probably nobody ever will. It is forgotten now. A conservative, semi-official figure of 3 million is often accepted, but I am not inclined to doubt other estimates ranging as high as 6 million. This catastrophe passed hardly noticed in the Western world, and even in the coastal cities of China, but a few courageous Chinese and foreigners attached to an American-financed China International Famine Relief Commission, including its secretary Dwight Edwards, O.J. Todd, the American engineer, and a wonderful American missionary doctor, Robert Ingram, risked their lives in those typhus-infested areas, trying to salvage some of the human wreckage. I spent some days with them, passing through cities of death, across a once fertile countryside turned into desert wasteland, through a land of naked horror. I was 23. I had come to the East looking for the glamour of the Orient, searching for adventure. This excursion to Suiyuan had begun as something like that, but here for the first time in my life, I came abruptly upon men who were dying because they had nothing to eat. In those hours of nightmare I spent in Suiyuan, I saw thousands of men, women, and children starving to death before my eyes. Have you ever seen a man, a good, honest man, who has worked hard, a law-abiding citizen, doing no serious harm to anyone, when he's had no food for more than a month? It is a most agonizing sight. His dying flesh hangs from him in wrinkled folds. You can clearly see every bone in his body. His eyes stare out unseeing, and even if he is a youth of 20, he moves like an ancient crone, dragging himself from spot to spot. If he has been lucky, he has long ago sold his wife and daughters. He has also sold everything he owns, the timber of his house itself, and most of his clothes. Sometimes he has indeed even sold the last rag of decency, and he sways there in the scorching sun, his testicles dangling from him like withered olive seeds, the last grim jest to remind you that this was once a man. Children are even more pitiable, with their little skeletons bent over and misshapen, their crooked bones, their little arms like twigs, and their purpling bellies filled with bark and sawdust, protruding like tumours. Women lie slumped in corners waiting for death, their black blade-like buttocks protruding, their breasts hanging like collapsed sacks. But there are, after all, not many women and girls. Most of them have died or been sold. Those were things I myself had seen, and would never forget. Millions of people died that way in famine, and thousands more still died in China like that. I had seen fresh corpses on the streets of Saratsi, and in the villages I had seen shallow graves where victims of famine and disease were laid by the dozens. But these were not the most shocking things after all. The shocking thing was that in many of those towns there were still rich men, rice hoarders, wheat hoarders, moneylenders, and landlords, with armed guards to defend them, while they profiteered enormously. The shocking thing was that in the cities where officials danced or played with sing-song girls, there was grain and food, and had been for months. That in Beijing and Tianjin and elsewhere were thousands of tons of wheat and millet, collected mostly by contributions from abroad by the Famine Commission, but which could not be shipped to the starving. Why not? Because in the Northwest there were some militarists who wanted to hold all of their railroad rolling stock and would release none of it toward the East, while in the East there were other Kuomintang generals who would send no rolling stock westward, even to starving people, because they feared it would be seized by their rivals. While famine raged, the commission decided to build a big canal with American funds to help flood some of the lands baked by drought. The officials gave them every cooperation and promptly began to buy for a few cents an acre all the lands to be irrigated. A flock of vultures descended upon this benighted country and purchased from the starving farmers thousands of acres for the taxes in arrears or for a few coppers, and held it to await tenants and rainy days. Yet the great majority of those people who died did so without any active protest. Why don't they revolt, I asked myself. Why don't they march in a great army and attack the scoundrels who can tax them but cannot feed them, who can seize their lands but cannot repair an irrigation canal? Or why don't they sweep into the great cities and plunder the wealth of the rascals who buy their daughters and wives, the men who continue to gorge on 36-course banquets while honest men starve? Why not? I was profoundly puzzled by their passivity. For a while I thought nothing would make a Chinese fight. I was mistaken. The Chinese peasant was not passive. He was not a coward. He would fight when given a method, an organization, leadership, a workable program, hope, and arms. The development of communism in China had proved that. Against the above background, therefore, it should not surprise us to learn that communists were popular in the Northwest, for conditions there had been no better for the mass of the peasantry than elsewhere in China. Evidence to that effect had been vividly documented by Dr. A. Stamper, the distinguished health expert sent by the League of Nations as advisor to the Nanjing government. It was the best thing available on the subject. Dr. Stamper had toured the Guomindang areas of Shanxi and Gansu, and his reports were based on his own observations as well as official data opened for him. He pointed out that in the year 240 BC, an engineer called Zheng Guo is said to have constructed a system for irrigating nearly 1 million acres in the historic Wei Valley of Shanxi, cradle of the Chinese race, but that this system was neglected, the dams collapsed, and though new works were from time to time carried out, the amount of territory irrigated at the end of the Manchu dynasty in 1912 was less than 20,000 mo, about 3,300 acres. Figures he obtained showed that during the Great Famine, 62% of the population died outright in one county of Shanxi, in another 75%, and so on. Official estimates revealed that 2 million people starved in Gansu alone, about 20% of the population. To quote from this Geneva investigator on conditions in the Northwest before the Reds arrived, in the famine of 1930, 20 acres of land could be purchased for 3 days' food supply. Making use of this opportunity, the wealthy classes of the province, in Shanxi, built up large estates, and the number of owner-cultivators diminished. The following extract from the report for 1930, Mr. Findlay Andrew of the China International Famine Relief Commission conveys a good impression of the situation that year. Quote, "The external appearances of the province have much improved on those of last year. Why? Because in this particular section of Gansu with which our work deals, death from starvation, pestilence, and sword have doomed, during the past 2 years, such large numbers of the population that the very demand for food has considerably lessened." End of quote. Much land had become waste. Much had been concentrated in the hands of landlords and officials. Gansu especially had surprisingly large areas of cultivable but uncultivated land. Land during the famine of 1928 to 1930 was bought at extremely cheap rates by landowners who, since that period, have realized fortunes by the execution of the Weibei irrigation project, a famine relief measure financed by the Commission. In Shanxi, it is considered a mark of honor to pay no land tax, and wealthy landowners are therefore, as a rule, exempted. A practice which is particularly undesirable is to claim arrears of taxes for the period during which they were absent from the farmers who abandoned their land during famines, the farmers being forbidden to resume possession until their arrears are paid. Dr. Stamper found that Shanxi farmers, evidently excluding the landlords who were as a rule exempted, had to pay land taxes and surtaxes amounting to about 45% of their income, while other taxes represent a further 20%. And not only is taxation thus fantastically heavy, but its assessment appears to be haphazard, and its manner of collection wasteful, brutal, and in many cases corrupt. As for Gansu, Dr. Stamper said, "The revenues of Gansu have during the last 5 years averaged over 8 millions, heavier taxation than in Zhejiang, one of the richest and most heavily taxed provinces in China. It will be seen also that this revenue, especially in Gansu, is not drawn from 1 or 2 major sources, but from a multitude of taxes, each yielding a small sum. Scarcely any commodity or productive or commercial activity going untaxed. The amount which the population pays is even higher than is shown by the published figures. In the first place, the tax collectors are able to retain a share, in some cases a very large share, of the amounts collected. In the second place, the taxes levied by the provincial or xian governments must be added to those imposed by military leaders, which in Gansu province are officially estimated at more than 10 million. A further cause of expense to the population is the local militia, the Mintuan, which, formed originally for defense against the bandits, has in many instances degenerated into a gang living at the cost of the countryside. Dr. Stampar quoted figures showing that the cost of supporting the Mintuan ranged from 30 to 40% of the total local government budget. This quite in addition, of course, to the burden of maintaining the regular armies. These latter, according to Dr. Stampar, had absorbed over 60% of the provincial revenues in both Gansu and Shanxi. A foreign missionary I met in Shanxi told me that he had once personally followed a pig from owner to consumer, and in the process saw 6 different taxes being paid. Another missionary of Gansu described seeing peasants knock down the wooden walls of their houses, wood being expensive in the northwest, and cart it to the market to sell in order to pay tax collectors. He said that the attitude of even some of the rich peasants, while not friendly when the Reds first arrived, was one of indifference and a belief that no government could be worse than the old. And yet the northwest was by no means a hopeless country economically. It was not overpopulated. Much of its land was very rich. It could easily produce far more than it could consume, and with an improved irrigation system, parts of it might become a Chinese Ukraine. Shanxi and Gansu had abundant coal deposits. Shanxi had oil. Dr. Stampar prophesied that Shanxi, especially the plain in the neighborhood of Xi'an, may itself become an industrial center of importance second only to the Yangtze Valley, and needing for its service its own coal fields. Mineral deposits of Gansu, Qinghai, and Xinjiang, said to be very rich, were scarcely touched. In gold alone, said Stampar, the region may turn out to be a second Klondike. Here, surely, were conditions which seemed overripe for change. Here, surely, were things for men to fight against, even if they had nothing to fight for. And no wonder when the Red Star appeared in the northwest, thousands of men arose to welcome it as a symbol of hope and freedom. But did the Reds, after all, prove any better? 3. Soviet society. Whatever it may have been in the South, Chinese communism as I found it in the Northwest might be more accurately called rural egalitarianism than anything Marx would have found acceptable as a model child of his own. This was manifestly true economically, and although in the social, political, and cultural life of the organized Soviets there was a crude Marxist guidance, limitations of material conditions were everywhere obvious. There was no machine industry of any importance in the Northwest. It was farming and grazing country primarily, the culture of which had been for centuries in stagnation, though many of the economic abuses prevalent no doubt reflected the changing economy in the semi-industrialized cities. Yet the Red Army itself was an outstanding product of the impact of industrialization on China, and the shock of the ideas it had brought into the fossilized culture here was in a true sense revolutionary. Objective conditions, however, denied the Reds the possibility of organizing much more than the political framework for the beginnings of a modern economy, of which naturally they could think only in terms of a future which might give them power in the great cities, where they could take over the industrial bases from the foreign concessions, and thus lay the foundations for a socialist society. Meanwhile, in the rural areas, their activity centered chiefly on the solution of the immediate problems of the peasants, land and taxes. But Chinese communists never regarded land distribution as anything more than a phase in the building of a mass base, a stage enabling them to develop the revolutionary struggle toward the conquest of power and the ultimate realization of thoroughgoing socialist changes. In the document Fundamental Laws of the Chinese Soviet Republic, the first All-China Soviet Congress in 1931 had set forth in detail the maximum program of the Communist Party of China, and reference to it showed clearly that the ultimate aim of Chinese communists was a socialist state of the Marxist-Leninist conception. Meanwhile, however, the social, political, and economic organization of the Red Districts had all along been a very provisional affair. Even in Jiangxi it was little more than that. Because the Soviets had to fight for an existence from the beginning, their main task was always to build a military and political base for the extension of the revolution, on a wider and deeper scale, rather than to try out communism in China, which is what some people thought the Reds were attempting in their little blockaded areas. The immediate basis of support for the Reds in the Northwest was obviously not so much from the idea of from each according to his ability to each according to his need, as it was something like the promise of Dr. Sun Yat-sen, land to those who till it. While theoretically the Soviets were a workers' and peasants' government, in actual practice the whole constituency was overwhelmingly peasant in character and occupation, and the regime had to shape itself accordingly. An attempt was made to balance peasant influence and offset it by classifying the rural population into these categories: great landlords, middle and small landlords, rich peasants, middle peasants, poor peasants, tenant peasants, rural workers, handicraft workers, lumpen proletariat, and a division called 族有职业切, or professional workers, which included teachers, doctors, and technicians, the rural intelligentsia. These divisions were political as well as economic, and in the Soviet elections, the tenant peasants, rural workers, handicraft workers, and so on were given a very much greater representation than the other categories, the aim apparently being to create some kind of democratic dictatorship of the rural proletariat. Within these limitations, the Soviets seemed to work very well in areas where the regime was stabilized. The structure of representative government was built up from the village Soviet, as the smallest unit. Above it were the district Soviet, the county Soviet, and the provincial and central Soviets. Each village elected its delegates to the higher Soviets, clear up to the delegates elected for the Soviet Congress. Suffrage was universal over the age of 16, but it was not equal for reasons mentioned above. Various committees were established under each of the district Soviets. An all-powerful committee, usually elected in a mass meeting shortly after the occupation of a district by the Red Army, and preceded by an intensified propaganda campaign, was the Revolutionary Committee. It called for elections or re-elections and closely cooperated with the Communist Party. Under the district Soviet, and appointed by it, were committees for education, cooperatives, military training, political training, land, public health, partisan training, revolutionary defense, enlargement of the Red Army, agrarian mutual aid, Red Army land tilling, and others. Such committees were found in every branch organ of the Soviets, right up to the central government, where policies were coordinated and state decisions made. Organization did not stop with the government itself. The Communist Party had an extensive membership among farmers and workers, in the towns and in the villages. In addition, there were the Young Communists, and under them 2 organizations which embraced in their membership most of the youth. These were called 少年先锋队 and the 儿童团, the Young Vanguards and the Children's Brigades. The Communist Party organized the women also into communist youth leagues, anti-Japanese societies, nursing schools, weaving schools, and tilling brigades. Adult farmers were organized into the Pinminhui, or Poor People's Society, and into the anti-Japanese societies. Even the Elder Brother Society was brought into Soviet life and given open and legal work to do. The Nongmin Dui, or Peasant Guards, and the Yuji Dui, or Partisan Roving Brigades, were also part of the intensely organized rural political and social structure. The work of all these organizations and their various committees was coordinated by the Central Soviet government, the Communist Party, and the Red Army. Here we need not enter into statistical detail to explain the organic connections of these groups, but it can be said in general that they were all skillfully interwoven, and each directly under the guidance of some communist, though decisions of organization, membership, and work seemed to be carried out in a democratic way by the peasants themselves. The aim of Soviet organization obviously was to make every man, woman, and child a member of something, with definite work assigned to him to perform. Rather typical of the intensity of Soviet efforts were the methods used to increase production and utilize great areas of wasteland. I procured copies of many orders, quite astonishing in their scope and common-sense practicality, issued by the Land Commission to its various branches to guide them in organizing and propagandizing the peasants in the tasks of cultivation. To illustrate, in one of these orders that I picked up in a branch of the Land Office, instructions were given concerning spring cultivation, the Commission urging its workers to make widespread propaganda to induce the masses to participate voluntarily, without involving any form of compulsory command. Detailed advice was offered on how to achieve the 4 main demands of this planting period, which the previous winter had been recognized by the Soviets to be more extensive utilization of wasteland and expansion of Red Army land, increased crop yields, greater diversity of crops with special emphasis on new varieties of melons and vegetables, and expansion of cotton acreage. Among the devices recommended by this order to expand labor power, and especially to bring women directly into agricultural production, particularly in districts where the male population had declined as a result of enlistments in the Red Army, the following ingenious instruction suggested the efficiency with which the Reds went about utilizing their available materials. Quote, to mobilize women, boys, and old men to participate in spring planting and cultivation, each according to his ability to carry on either a principal or an auxiliary task in the labor process of production. For example, large feet, or unbound feet, and young women should be mobilized to organize production teaching corps, with tasks varying from land clearance up to the main tasks of agricultural production itself. Small or bound feet, young boys and old men must be mobilized to help in weed pulling, collecting dung, and for other auxiliary tasks. But how did the peasants feel about this? The Chinese peasant was supposed to hate organization, discipline, and any social activity beyond his own family. The Reds laughed when that was mentioned. They said that no Chinese peasant disliked organization or social activity if he was working for himself and not the Mintuan, the landlord or the tax collector. And I had to admit that most of the peasants to whom I talked seemed to support Soviets and the Red Army. Many of them were very free in their criticisms and complaints, but when I asked whether they preferred it to the old days, the answer was nearly always an emphatic yes. I noticed also that most of them talked about the Soviets as 我们的政府, or our government, and this struck me as something new in rural China. One thing which suggested that the Reds had their base in the mass of the population was that in all the older Soviet districts, the policing and guarding was done almost entirely by the peasant organizations alone. There were few actual Red Army garrisons in the Soviet districts, all the fighting strength of the army being kept at the front. Local defense was shared by the Village Revolutionary Defense Corps, peasant guards, and partisans. This fact could explain some of the apparent popularity of the Red Army with the poor peasantry, for it was rarely planted down on them as an instrument of oppression and exploitation, like other armies, but was generally at the front, fighting for its food there and engaged in meeting enemy attacks. On the other hand, the intensive organization of the peasantry created a rearguard and a base which freed the Red Army to operate with the extreme mobility for which it was noted. To understand peasant support for the communist movement, it was necessary to keep in mind the burden borne by the peasantry in the northwest under the former regime. Now, wherever the Reds went, there was no doubt that they radically changed the situation for the tenant farmer, the poor farmer, the middle farmer, and all the have-not elements. All forms of taxation were abolished in the new districts for the first year to give the farmers breathing space, and in the old districts only a progressive single tax on land was collected, and a small single tax from 5 to 10% on business. Second, the Reds gave land to the land-hungry peasants and began the reclamation of great areas of wasteland, mostly the land of absentee or fleeing landlords. Third, they took land and livestock from the wealthy classes and redistributed them among the poor. Redistribution of land was a fundamental Red policy. How was it carried out? Later on, for reasons of national political maneuver, there was to be a drastic retreat in the Soviet land policy, but when I travelled in the Northwest, the land laws in force, promulgated by the Northwest Soviet government in December 1935, provided for the confiscation of all landlords' land, and the confiscation of all land of rich peasants that was not cultivated by the owners themselves. However, both the landlord and the rich peasant were allowed as much land as they could till with their own labour. In districts where there was no land scarcity, and there were many such districts in the Northwest, the lands of resident landlords and rich peasants were in practice not confiscated at all, but the wasteland and land of absentee owners was distributed, and sometimes there was a redivision of best quality land, poor peasants being given better soil, and landlords being allotted the same amount of poorer land. What was a landlord? Well, according to the communist definition, greatly simplified, any farmer who collected the greater part of his income from land rented out to others, and not from his own labour, was a landlord. By this definition, the usurers and tuhao were put in about the same category as landlords, and similarly treated. Usury rates, according to Dr. Stampar, had formerly ranged as high as 60% in the Northwest, or very much higher in times of stress. Although land was very cheap in many parts of Gansu, Shanxi, and Ningxia, cash was unbelievably scarce. In practice, it was nearly impossible for a farm worker or tenant with no capital to accumulate enough to buy sufficient land for his family. I met farmers in the red districts who formerly had never been able to own any land, although rates in some places were as low as $2 or $3 in silver an acre. Classes other than those mentioned above were not subject to confiscatory action, so a big percentage of the farmers stood to benefit immediately by the redistribution. The poorest farmers, tenants, and farm labourers were all provided with land enough for a livelihood. There did not seem to be an attempt to equalize land ownership. The primary purpose of the Soviet land laws, as explained to me by Wang Guanglan, the 29-year-old Russian returned student who was land commissioner of the 3 red provinces of the Northwest, was to provide for every person sufficient land to guarantee him and his family a decent livelihood, which was claimed to be the most urgent demand of the peasantry. The land problem, confiscation and redistribution, was greatly simplified in the Northwest by the fact that big estates were formerly owned by officials, tax collectors, and absentee landlords. With the confiscation of these, in many cases the immediate demands of the poor peasantry were satisfied, without much interference with either the resident small landlords or the rich peasants. Thus the Reds not only created the economic base for support in the poor and landless peasantry by giving them farms, but in some cases won the gratitude of middle peasants by abolishing tax exploitation, and in a few instances enlisted the aid of small landlords on the same basis or through the patriotic appeals of the anti-Japanese movement. Several prominent Xianxi communists came from landlord families. Additional help was given to the poor farmers in the form of loans at very low rates of interest, or no interest at all. Usury was almost entirely abolished, but private lending, at rates fixed at a maximum of 10% annually, was permitted. The original government lending rate was 5%. Several thousand simple agricultural implements made in the Red arsenals and thousands of pounds of seed grain were supplied to landless peasants, breaking wasteland. A primitive agricultural school had been established, and I was told it was planned to open an animal husbandry school as soon as an expert in this field, expected from Shanghai, had arrived. A cooperative movement was being vigorously pushed. These activities extended beyond production and distribution cooperatives, branching out to include cooperation in such novel, for China, forms as the collective use of farm animals and implements, especially in tilling public lands and Red Army lands, and in the organization of labor mutual aid societies. By the latter device, great areas could be quickly planted and harvested collectively, and periods of idleness by individual farmers eliminated. The Reds saw to it that a man earned his new land. In busy periods, the system of Saturday brigades was used, when not only all the children's organizations, but every Soviet official, Red partisan, Red Guard, women's organization member, and any Red Army detachment that happened to be nearby, were mobilized to work at least 1 day a week at farming tasks. Even Mao Zedong took part in this work. Here the Reds were introducing the germs of the drastically revolutionary idea of collective effort, and doing primary education work for some future period when collectivization might become practicable. At the same time, into the dark recesses of peasant mentality, there was slowly penetrating the concept of a broader realm of social life, for the organizations created among the peasantry were what the Reds called 3-in-1, economic, political, and cultural, in their utility. What cultural progress the Reds had made among these people was by advanced Western standards negligible indeed, but certain outstanding evils common in most parts of China had definitely been eliminated in the score of long Sovietized counties in northern Xianxi, and a crusade of propaganda was being conducted among inhabitants of newer areas to spread the same elementary reforms there. As an outstanding achievement, opium had been completely eliminated in northern Xianxi, and in fact I did not see any sign of poppies after I entered the Soviet districts. Official corruption was almost unheard of. Beggary and unemployment did seem to have been, as the Reds claimed, liquidated. I did not see a beggar during all my travels in the Red areas. Foot binding and infanticide were criminal offences. Child slavery and prostitution had disappeared, and polyandry and polygamy were prohibited. The myths of communized wives and nationalization of women are too patently absurd to be denied, but changes in marriage, divorce, and inheritance were in themselves extremely radical against the background of semi-feudal law and practice elsewhere in China. Marriage regulations included interesting provisions against mother-in-law tyranny, the buying and selling of women as wives and concubines, and the custom of arranged matches. Marriage was by mutual consent. The legal age had been moved up sharply to 20 for men and 18 for women. Dowries were prohibited, and any couple registering as man and wife before a county, municipal, or village soviet was given a marriage certificate without cost. Men and women actually cohabiting were considered legally married, whether registered or not, which seemed to rule out free love. All children were legitimate under Soviet law. Divorce could also be secured from the Registration Bureau of the Soviet, free of charge, on the insistent demand of either party to the marriage contract, but wives of Red Army men were required to have their husbands' consent before a divorce was granted. Property was divided equally between the divorcees, and both were legally obliged to care for their children, but responsibility for debts was shouldered by the male alone, who was also obliged to supply 2/3 of the children's living expenses. Education in theory was free and universal, but parents were obliged to supply their children with food and clothing. In practice, nothing like free and universal education had yet been achieved, although old Xu Deli, the Commissioner of Education, boasted to me that if they were given a few years of peace in the northwest, they would astound the rest of China with the educational progress they would make. Further on, I was to learn in more detail what the communists had done and hoped to do to liquidate the appalling illiteracy of this region, but first it was interesting to know how the government was financing not only the educational program, such as it was, but this whole seemingly simple and yet in its way vastly complex organism, which I have called Soviet society. 4. Anatomy of money. It was imperative for the Soviet economy to fulfill at least 2 elementary functions: to feed and equip the Red Army, and to bring immediate relief to the poor peasantry. Failing in either, the Soviet base would soon collapse. To guarantee success at these tasks, it was necessary for the Reds, even from the earliest days, to begin some kind of economic construction. Soviet economy in the Northwest was a curious mixture of private capitalism, state capitalism, and primitive socialism. Private enterprise and industry were permitted and encouraged, and private transaction in the land and its products was allowed, with restrictions. At the same time, the state owned and exploited enterprises such as oil wells, salt wells, and coal mines, and it traded in cattle, hides, salt, wool, cotton, paper, and other raw materials. But it did not establish a monopoly in these articles, and in all of them private enterprises could, and to some extent did, compete. A third kind of economy was created by the establishment of cooperatives, in which the government and the masses participated as partners, competing not only with private capitalism but also with state capitalism. But it was all conducted on a very small and primitive scale. Thus, although the fundamental antagonisms in such an arrangement were obvious, and in an economically more highly developed area would have been ruinous, here in the Red regions they somehow supplemented each other. The Reds defined the cooperative as an instrument to resist private capitalism and develop a new economic system, and they listed its 5 main functions as follows: to combat the exploitation of the masses by the merchants, to combat the enemy's blockade, to develop the national economy of the Soviet districts, to raise the economic-political level of the masses, and to prepare the conditions for socialist construction, a period in which the democratic revolution of the Chinese bourgeoisie, under the leadership of the proletariat, may create energetic conditions enabling the transition of this revolution into socialism. The first 2 of those high-sounding functions in practice meant simply that the cooperative could help the masses organize their own blockade-running corps, as auxiliaries to the blockade-running activity of the government. Trade between red and white districts was prohibited by Nanjing, but by using small mountain roads and by oiling the palms of border guards, the Reds at times managed to carry on a fairly lively export business. Taking out raw materials from the Soviet districts, the Transport Corps in the service of the State Trade Bureau, or the cooperatives, exchanged them for Kuomintang money and needed manufactures. Consumption, sales, production, and credit cooperatives were organized in the village, district, county, and province. Above them was a central bureau of cooperatives, under the finance commissioner and a department of national economy. These cooperatives were really constructed to encourage the participation of the lowest strata of society. Shares entitling the purchaser to membership were priced as low as 50 cents, or even 20 cents, and organizational duties were so extensive as to bring nearly every shareholder into the economic or political life of the cooperative. While there was no restriction on the number of shares an individual member could buy, each member was entitled to but 1 vote, regardless of how many shares he held. Cooperatives elected their own managing committees and supervisory committees, with the assistance of the Central Bureau, which also furnished trained workers and organizers. Each cooperative had departments for business, propaganda, organization, survey, and statistics. Various prizes were offered for efficient management, and widespread propaganda stimulated and educated the peasants concerning the usefulness of the movement. Financial as well as technical help was furnished by the government, which participated in the enterprises on a profit-sharing basis, like the members. Some $70,000 in non-interest-bearing loans had been invested by the government in the cooperatives of Shanxi and Gansu. Only Soviet paper was in use, except in the border counties where white paper was also accepted. In their Soviets in Jiangxi, Anhui, and Sichuan, the Reds minted silver dollars and subsidiary coins in copper and also some in silver, and much of this metal was transported to the northwest. But after the decree of November 1935, when Nanjing began the confiscation of all silver in China and its price soared, the Reds withdrew their silver and held it as a reserve for their note issue. Paper currency in the south, bearing the signature of the Chinese Workers' and Peasants' Soviet Government State Bank, was excellently printed on good bank paper. In the northwest, technical deficiencies resulted in a much cruder issue on poor paper, and sometimes on cloth. Their slogans appeared on all money. Notes issued in Xianxi bore such exhortations as "Stop Civil War, Unite to Resist Japan, Long Live the Chinese Revolution." But how could merchants sell articles imported from the white regions for currency which had no exchange value outside the Soviet districts? This difficulty was met by the state treasury, which had fixed an exchange rate of $1.21 of Soviet money to $1 of Kuomintang money. Regulations provided that all goods imported from the white districts and sold directly to the State Trade Bureau will be paid for in foreign or Kuomintang currency. Imports of necessities, when not sold directly to the State Trade Bureau but through cooperatives or by private merchants, shall first be registered with the State Trade Bureau, and proceeds of their sale for Soviet currency may be exchanged for white paper. Other exchange will be given when its necessity is established. In practice, this of course meant that all foreign imports had to be paid for in foreign exchange. But as the value of imported manufactures, meagre enough, greatly exceeds the value of Soviet exports, which were chiefly raw materials and were all sold in a depressed market as smuggled goods, there was always a tendency toward a heavy, unfavourable balance of payments. In other words, bankruptcy. How was this overcome? It was not entirely. As far as I could discover, the problem was met principally by the ingenuity of Lin Xuhan, the dignified white-haired Commissioner of Finance, whose task was to make red ends meet. This interesting old custodian of the Exchequer had once been treasurer of the Kuomintang, and behind him lay an amazing story. Son of a Hunanese schoolteacher, Lin Xuhan was born in 1882, educated in the classics, attended normal college at Zhangdefu, and later studied in Tokyo. While in Japan, he met Sun Yat-sen, then exiled from China by the Manchus, and joined his secret revolutionary society, the Tongmenghui. When Sun merged his Tongmenghui with other revolutionary groups to found the Kuomintang, Lin became a charter member. Later on, he met Chen Du-xiu, was much influenced by him, and in 1922 joined the Communist Party. He continued to work closely with Dr. Sun Yat-sen, however, who admitted communists to his party, and Lin was in turn treasurer and chairman of the General Affairs Department of the Kuomintang. He was with Sun Yat-sen when he died. At the beginning of the Nationalist Revolution, Lin was one of the several elders of the Central Executive Committee of the Kuomintang who held seniority over Chiang Kai-shek. In Guangzhou, he was chairman of the Peasant Department, and during the Northern Expedition he became political commissar of the 6th Army, commanded by General Chang Jian, the late Chief of Staff at Nanjing. When Chiang Kai-shek began the extermination of the Communists in 1927, Lin denounced him, fled to Hong Kong, and then to Soviet Russia, where he studied for 4 years in the Communist Academy. On his return to China, he took passage on the Underground Railway and safely reached Jiangxi. Now a widower, Lin had not seen his grown-up daughter and son since 1927. At the age of 45, he had abandoned the comfortable assets of his position and staked his destiny with the young communists. Into my room in the Foreign Office one morning came this 55-year-old veteran of the Long March, wearing a cheerful smile, a faded uniform, a red-starred cap with a broken peak, and in front of his kindly eyes a pair of spectacles, one side of which was trussed up over his ear with a piece of string. The Commissioner of Finance. He sat down on the edge of the Kang, and we began to talk about sources of revenue. The government, I understood, collected practically no taxes. Its industrial income must be negligible. Then where, I wanted to know, did it get its money? Lin began to explain. We say we do not tax the masses, and this is true. But we do heavily tax the exploiting classes, confiscating their surplus cash and goods. Thus all our taxation is direct. This is just the opposite of the Kuomintang practice, under which ultimately the workers and the poor peasants have to carry most of the tax burden. Here we tax less than 10% of the population, the landlords and the usurers. We also levy a small tax on a few big merchants, but none on small merchants. Later on we may impose a small progressive tax on the peasantry, but at the present moment all mass taxes have been completely abolished. Another source of income is from voluntary contributions of the people. Revolutionary patriotic feeling runs very high where war is on, and the people realize that they may lose their Soviets. They make big voluntary contributions of food, money, and clothing to the Red Army. We derive some income also from state trade, from Red Army lands, from our own industries, from the cooperatives, and from bank loans. But of course our biggest revenue is from confiscations. By confiscations, I interrupted, you mean what is commonly described as loot? Lin laughed shortly. The Kuomintang calls it loot. Well, if taxation of the exploiters of the masses is loot, so is the Kuomintang's taxation of the masses. But the Red Army does no looting in the sense that white armies loot. Confiscations are made only by authorized persons under direction of the Finance Commission. Every item must be reported by inventory to the government and is utilized only for the general benefit of society. Private looting is heavily punished. Just ask the people if Red soldiers take anything without paying for it. Well, you are quite right. The answer to that naturally would depend on whether you asked a landlord or a peasant. If we did not have to conduct incessant war, Lin continued, we could easily build a self-supporting economy here. Our budget is carefully made, and every possible economy is practiced. Because every Soviet official is also a patriot and a revolutionary, we demand no wages, and we can exist on but little food. It will probably surprise you to know how small our budget is for this whole area. Our present expenditure is only about $320,000 per month. This represents good value as well as money value. Of this sum, from 40 to 50% comes from confiscations, and 15 to 20% comes from voluntary contributions, including cash raised by the party among our supporters in the White districts. The rest of our revenue is derived from trade, economic construction, Red Army lands, and bank loans to the government. The Reds claim to have devised a squeeze-proof machinery of budgeting, of receipts and disbursements. I read part of Lin Xiuhan's outline for budget compilation, which gave a detailed description of the systems and all its safeguards. Its integrity seemed to be based primarily on collective control of receipts and disbursements. From the highest organ down to the village, the treasurer was accountable, for both payments and collections, to a supervising committee, so that juggling of figures for individual profit was extremely difficult. Commissioner Lin was very proud of his system, and asserted that under it any kind of squeeze was effectively impossible. It may have been true. Anyway, it was obvious that in the Red districts the real problem as yet was not one of squeeze in the traditional sense, but of squeezing through. Despite Lin's cheerful optimism, this was what I wrote in my diary after that interview. Whatever Lin's figures may mean exactly, it is simply a Chinese miracle when one remembers that partisans have been fighting back and forth across this territory for 5 years, that the economy maintains itself at all, that there is no famine, and that the peasants on the whole seem to accept Soviet currency with faith in it. In fact, this cannot be explained in terms of finance alone, but is only understandable on a social and political basis. Nevertheless, it is perfectly clear that the situation is extremely grave, even for an organization that exists on such shoestrings as the Reds feed upon, and one of 3 changes must shortly occur in Soviet economy. 1. Some form of machine industrialization to supply the market with needed manufactures. 2. The establishment of a good connection with some modern economic base in the outside world, or the capture of some economic base on a higher level than the present one, Xi'an or Lanzhou, for example. Or 3. The actual coalescence of such a base now under white control with the Red districts. The Reds did not share my pessimism. A way out is sure to be found, and in a few months later, it was. The way out appeared in the form of an actual coalescence. Lin did not seem to be getting ahead financially very fast himself, by the way. His allowance as Commissioner of Finance was $5 a month of Red money. 5. Life begins at 50. I called him Old Xu because that's what everyone in the Soviet districts called him, Lao Xu, the educator. For although 61 was only just an average age for most high government officials elsewhere in the Orient, in Red China he seemed a sort of hoary grandfather by contrast with others, yet he was no specimen of decrepitude. Like his sexagenarian crony, Xie Zhucai, and you could often see this pair of white-haired bandits walking along arm in arm like middle school lads, he had an erect and vigorous step, bright and merry eyes, and a pair of muscular legs that had carried him across the greatest rivers and mountain ranges of China on the Long March. Xu Deli had been a highly respected professor until at the age of 50 he amazingly gave up his home, 4 children, and the presidency of a normal school in Changsha to stake his future with the communists. Born in 1877 near Changsha, not far from Peng Dehuai's birthplace, he was the 4th son in a poor peasant family. By various sacrifices his parents gave him 6 years of schooling, at the end of which he became a schoolteacher under the Manchu regime. There he remained until he was 29, when he entered Changsha Normal College, graduated, and became an instructor in mathematics, a discipline in which he was self-taught. Mao Zedong was one of his students in the normal school. Zhou said he was terrible in maths, and so were many youths who later became Reds. Zhou himself had a role in politics long before Mao knew a Republican from a monarchist. He still bore that mark of combat from feudal politics in days of the Empire, when he cut off the tip of his little finger to demonstrate his sincerity in begging by petition that a parliament be granted to the people. After the First Revolution, when for a while Hunan had a provincial parliament, old Zhou was a member of it. He accompanied the Hunanese delegation of worker students to France after the war, and he studied a year at Lyon, where he paid his way by odd-time work in a metal factory. Later he was a student for 3 years at the University of Paris, earning his tuition then by tutoring Chinese students in mathematics. Returning to Hunan in 1923, he helped establish 2 modern normal schools in the capital and for 4 years enjoyed some prosperity. Not till 1927 did he become a communist and an outcast from bourgeois society. During the Nationalist Revolution, Xu Deli was active in the provincial Kuomintang, but he sympathized with the communists. He openly preached Marxism to his students. When the purgation period began, he was a marked man. He had to do the disappearing act, and having no connection with the Communist Party, he had to find a haven of his own. I had wanted to be a communist, he told me rather wistfully, but no one ever asked me to join. I was already 50, and I concluded that the communists considered me too old. But one day a communist sought out Xu in his hiding place and asked him to enter the party. He told me that he wept then to think that he was still of some use in building a new world. The party sent him to Russia, where he studied for 2 years. On his return, he ran the blockade to Jiangxi. Soon afterwards, he became Assistant Commissioner of Education under Chu Qiupai, and after Qiu was killed, the executive committee appointed Xu in his place. Since then, he had been Lao Xu, the educator, and surely his varied experience, life and teaching under monarchist, capitalist, and communist forms of society seemed to qualify him for the tasks that faced him. He certainly needed all that experience, and more, for those tasks were so great that any Western educator would have despaired. But old Xu was too young to be discouraged. One day when we were talking, he began humorously to enumerate some of his difficulties. As nearly as we can estimate, he asserted, virtually nobody but a few landlords, officials, and merchants could read in the Northwest before we arrived. The illiteracy seemed to be about 95%. This is culturally one of the darkest places on earth. Do you know the people in North Xianxi and Gansu believe that water is harmful to them? The average man here has a bath about once in his life. Once when he is born, the second time when he is married. They hate to wash their feet, hands, or faces, or cut their nails or their hair. There are more pigtails left in this part of China than anywhere else. But all this and many other prejudices are due to ignorance, and it's my job to change their mentality. Such a population compared with Jiangxi is very backwards indeed. There the illiteracy was about 90%, but their cultural level was much higher. We had better material conditions to work in and many more trained teachers. In our model Xian, Xiankou, we had over 300 primary schools and about 800 school teachers, which is as many as we have of both in all the red districts here. When we withdrew from Xiankou, illiteracy had been reduced to less than 20% of the population. Here the work is very much slower. We have to start everything from the beginning. Our material resources are very limited, even our printing machinery has been destroyed, and now we have to print everything by mimeograph and stone block lithograph. The blockade prevents us from importing enough paper. We have begun to make paper of our own, but the quality is terrible. But never mind these difficulties, we have already been able to accomplish something. If we are given time, we can do things here that will astonish the rest of China. We are training scores of teachers from the masses now, and the party is training others. Many of them will become voluntary teachers for the mass education schools. Our results show that the peasants here are eager to learn when given the chance. And they are not stupid, they learn very quickly, and they change their habits when they are given good reasons for doing so. In the older Soviet districts here, you won't see any girl children with bound feet, and you will see many young women with bobbed hair. The men are gradually cutting off their cues now, and a lot of them are learning to read and write from the young communists and the vanguards. Xu explained that under the emergency Soviet educational system there were 3 sections: institutional, military, and social. The first was run more or less by the Soviets, and the second by the Red Army, the third by the communist organizations. Emphasis on all of them was primarily political. Even the smallest children learned their first characters in the shape of simple revolutionary slogans, and then worked forward into stories of conflict between the Reds and the Kuomintang, landlords and peasants, capitalists and workers, and so on. with plenty of heroics about the young communists and the Red Army and promises of an earthly paradise in the Soviet future. Under institutional education, the Reds already claimed to have established about 200 primary schools, and they had one normal school for primary teachers, one agricultural school, a textile school, a trade union school of 5 grades, and a party school with some 400 students. Courses in all the technical schools lasted only about 6 months. Greatest emphasis, naturally, was on military education, and here much had been achieved in 2 years, despite all the handicaps of the beleaguered little state. There were the Red Army University, the cavalry and infantry schools, and 2 party training schools, already described. There was a radio school and a medical school, which was really for training nurses. There was an engineering school where students received the rudimentary training of apprentices. Like the whole Soviet organization itself, everything was very provisional, and designed primarily as a kind of realign activity to strengthen the Red Army and provide it with new cadres. Many of the teachers were not even middle school graduates. What was interesting was the collective use of whatever knowledge they had. These schools were really communist, not only in ideology, but in the utilization of every scrap of technical experience they could mobilize to raise the cultural level. Even in social education, the Soviet aims were primarily political. There was no time or occasion to be teaching farmers literature or flower arrangement. The Reds were practical people. To the Lenin clubs, the communist youth leagues, the partisans, and the village Soviets, they sent simple, crudely illustrated 式子, no characters, texts, and helped mass organizations form self-study groups of their own, with some communist or literate among them as a leader. When the youths, or sometimes even aged peasants, began droning off the short sentences, they found themselves absorbing ideas along with their ideographs. Thus, entering one of these little social education centers in the mountains, you might hear these people catechizing themselves aloud. What is this? This is a red flag. What is this? This is a poor man. What is the red flag? The red flag is the flag of the Red Army. What is the Red Army? The Red Army is the army of the poor men. And so on, right up to the point where, if he knew the whole 500 or 600 characters before anyone else, the youth could collect the red tassel or pencil or whatever was promised. When farmers and farmers' sons and daughters finished the book, they could not only read for the first time in their lives, but they knew who had taught them, and why. They had grasped the basic fighting ideas of Chinese communism. In an effort to find a quicker medium for bringing literacy to the masses, the communists had begun a limited use of Latinized Chinese. They had worked out an alphabet of 28 letters by which they claimed to be able to reproduce nearly all Chinese phonetics, and had written and published a little pocket dictionary with the communist phrases of Chinese rendered into polysyllabic, easily readable words. Part of the paper, 红色中华, Red China, was published in Latin Hua, and old Zhou was experimenting with it on a class of youngsters he had picked up in Bao'an. He believed that the complicated Chinese characters would eventually have to be abandoned in education on a mass scale, and he had many arguments in favour of his system, on which he had been working for years. Thus far he wasn't boasting about results, either with his Latin Hua or the educational efforts. The cultural level was so low here it couldn't be made worse, so naturally we've made some progress, he said. As for the future, he only wanted time. Meanwhile, he urged me to concentrate on studying educational methods in the Red Army, where he claimed real revolutionary teaching could be seen.